Hey, how's it going? My name is Jordan Oloomi, and I want to talk to you today about a hot button topic in our country: refugees, foreigners, immigrants. Now, some of you, when I've just said those words, you felt a whole wide range of emotions, whether they're positive or negative. And one thing's for sure, you can't ignore this topic. Whether you live on the coastal cities or you're in the Midwest like me, immigrants and refugees are becoming a part of our society. They live in our cities, they live down the street from us, they shop at our grocery stores. And so I think it's important to ask the question, as Christ followers, what does the Bible command us as believers to do when we have immigrants and refugees living among us? And how should we look at them and view them? I want to read a story in 1 Samuel chapter 30 about David and his experience with a refugee. It says this: David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. Now, the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it to the ground and taken captive the women and everyone in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but they carried them off. And when David and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept out loud until they had no strength. In fact, David's two wives had been captured, Aniam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed because the men were talking about stoning them, each one bitter in their spirit because of his sons and daughters. So this is incredibly important to note when setting the scene for this passage. David and his men are just devastated. The Amalekites came in and just destroyed their hometown, burned it to the ground, and took all the children and women with them. And we learned in the passage that David found strength in the Lord. So let's keep reading. It says, David and 600 men came with him to the Besor Valley, where some of them stayed behind. 200 of them were too exhausted to cross the valley, but David and the 400 others, they continued the pursuit. Now, they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David. They gave him water to drink and food to eat, part of a cake of pressed figs and 2 cakes of raisin. He ate and was revived, for he had not eaten food or drunk any water for 3 days and 3 nights. David asked him, "Who do you belong to and where do you come from?" And he said, "I'm an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me when I became ill 3 days ago. We raided the Negev of the Kerethites, some territories belonging to Judah, and the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag." And David asked him, "Can you lead me down to this raiding party?" And he answered, "Swear to me before God that you won't kill me or hand me over to my master, and I'll take you down there." And so he led David down. I want to note 4 things in this passage that David did and use this kind of as our theological framework as believers in how we should interact with refugees and immigrants. The first thing is, David looked at this refugee with eyes of compassion. Now, the passage notes that this is an Egyptian man. Now, David, being an Israelite, he would have remembered that his ancestors had a bad experience with Egyptians. In fact, they enslaved his people. So now it's his turn to turn it around and enslave this man. But instead, David looks at him with compassion. I think he remembered what happened in Ziklag and how his city was burned to the ground and how he lost everything. And he saw himself in this man. That's why I think it's important for us to walk in others' shoes, to see their points of view. This is why I, as a young adults pastor, love taking young adults around the world on mission trips, because they get a new viewpoint, a new vantage point, and can see through eyes of compassion. The second thing that David does is that David takes care of his physical needs. It says immediately he gave him food, pressed figs, because he hadn't eaten or drank in 3 days. And so David takes care of his physical needs before doing anything, because no person wants to hear gospel or truth if they're hungry or if they have physical needs. And so he looks at them and he says, how can I take care of their physical needs? The third thing he does is David gets to know the refugee better. He asks him questions. Where do you come from? And what clan do you belong? He asks him questions. He doesn't state things to the refugee, but he asks him things to get to know him better. The last thing David does, the fourth thing, is David finds a place for him in his community, in his family. He gives him a purpose. We as people, we need a purpose to keep living. It can be extremely discouraging when you wake up each day and you have nothing to live for and move towards. And so David finds a place in society where he's needed, where his gifts are used. In this case, the refugee was part of the clan that burned down his town, and he was able to use the refugee to take him to where the Amalekites were. And he ends up taking back everything that he lost. Now, I think this is important to note that this is the last step that David does, and it's not the first step, meaning he doesn't come to the refugee and say, "What can you give us? If not, I'm not going to let you in." But he invites him in. He takes care of his needs. He sees the humanity, and he sees him as another person and takes care of him. I hope we can use this as our theological framework, that we can look through the eyes of compassion towards these refugees, that we can take care of their physical needs, that we can ask questions and get to know their stories, and finally find a place where they can fit in our community and in our family. So I truly believe if we use this as our theological framework to minister to refugees and immigrants, that we'll be doing the Great Commission, and our gospel will reach all ends of the earth.